Welcome to the 2019 Fall Convocation. You may be seated. Pleased to be with you this evening to conduct one of the most meaningful ceremonies of the academic year. In May, we gather in this same beautiful setting for commencement, which celebrates the achievements of our students and marks their transition to life after W&L. Then we disperse for the summer. Students travel, faculty immerse themselves in scholarship, and our staff accomplish important projects all over campus. Each of us is grateful for the change of pace and season, and yet there's something missing, something that impels us toward this moment when summer transitions into fall, in theory. Convocation is when we reassemble ourselves as a community, as students, as teachers, and as staff dedicated to providing an environment in which teaching and learning can take place. Our avocations, our callings, require our convocation, our being called together. None of us can be most truly who we are individually without all of us being here collectively, which is why this time of year feels so good. We're once again able to be our best selves. Convocation emphasizes and celebrates the fact that we are an academic community. We wear our ceremonial regalia to signify that our distinctively academic work, the fundamental work of the university, which unites us all, has commenced. We welcome our newly arrived undergraduates and law students, and we encourage the members of the class of 2020 to make the most of their final year at Washington and Lee. The centerpiece of this ceremony is the address that will be delivered by our distinguished speaker, Professor Bob Strong. He will be properly introduced momentarily, but I can't help saying a few words myself. I can vouch personally for Bob's mastery of the classroom since he and I taught a seminar together in my first semester at W&L. I learned a lot about Bob by watching him teach. He's disciplined and dedicated. He's earnest but funny. He's wise but humble. It's an effective and endearing combination which inspires our students and serves them well. Those same qualities have earned Bob the respect of his faculty colleagues who've elected him to serve as one of their representatives to the university's Board of Trustees. Bob is also a prolific and highly regarded scholar of the American presidency and foreign policy. Teacher, scholar, and university citizen, Bob Strong embodies what's at stake in our work here every day. It's work that never truly stops, but which officially recommences right now. The occasion is momentous enough that it calls for appropriate music, which we can always count on the university singers to provide. Their selection this evening, On Earth as It Is in Heaven, is from Ennio Morricone's Academy Award-winning score to the 1986 film, The Mission, which is known for using music as a bridge to bring people together, regardless of the challenges they face. Professor Lynch and the university singers, please take it away. Thank you, University Singers and Professor Lynch. I now call upon Mark Connor, Provost and Ballingy Professor of English, to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Bob Strong.
Robert A. Strong, the William Lyne Wilson Professor in Political Economy, has served Washington and Lee with distinction for 3 decades. Bob took his undergraduate degree from Kenyon College in 1970 and then served a 3-year tour of duty as an officer in the U.S. Navy. Having completed his PhD at the University of Virginia, and after teaching at Tulane and the University College of Wales, he came to W&L in 1989 as a professor of politics. He chaired the politics department for many years, served on multiple elected committees, and has long been a voice of reason, humor, and perspective among the W&L faculty. Bob is a noted scholar of the American presidency and American politics and government. His research involves national security issues and presidential foreign policy decisions in the modern era. He has published widely, including 4 major books: Bureaucracy and Statesmanship, Henry Kissinger and the Making of American Foreign Policy; Working in the World, Jimmy Carter and the Making of American Foreign Policy, described by one reviewer as, quote, the best book on Carter's foreign policy to date; Decisions and Dilemmas, Case Studies in Presidential Foreign Policy Making since 1945, and the forthcoming Character and Consequence, Foreign Policy Decisions of George H.W. Bush. Bob has been a visiting scholar at the Rothermere American Institute at Oxford University, a Fulbright Scholar at University College Dublin, and an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow. His teaching has ranged quite broadly, from standard American politics courses to nuclear proliferation issues to the philosophy of higher education, co-taught with President Will Dudley, to this very fall term, a seminar on impeachment and the American presidency. He constantly adapts his teaching to fit issues in areas of both national and student concern and interest. Bob has generously served the university in senior administration. He became our first associate provost in 2008 when June Aprilli asked him to work with her in the provost's office. He was the first to oversee the new Johnson program in leadership and integrity. He then served as interim provost for 2 years. Bob's dedication to Washington and Lee is legendary, and his career serves as an inspiring model for what a liberal arts college professor can be. Today, his remarks are titled George Washington and Education, a strikingly apt topic for this event and for this institution. Please join me in welcoming Bob Strong.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, and I want to thank President Dudley for giving me the opportunity to speak at this occasion. This afternoon, I want to take a few moments to tell some stories about a familiar figure. We all know a great deal about George Washington, father of our country, our first president, generous donor to this institution, half our namesake. But we may not know much or enough about his personal and political connections to higher education. George Washington never went to college. Born to privilege, he grew up expecting to receive a superior education, and there were plans. He was going to follow in the footsteps of his older brother and study in England. But then his father died suddenly of a heart attack, and those plans died with him. Washington, while still a teenager, took on adult responsibilities: the management of land, the supervision of an enslaved workforce, the surveying of distant property, and when he was about the same age as the members of our senior class, military service in defense of the colonies. Washington always regretted his lack of a proper education. John Adams, in an unkind moment, he had a number of those, said that Washington was too illiterate, unlearned, and unread for his station and reputation. Jefferson observed that he possessed neither copiousness of ideas nor fluency of words. Washington never learned a foreign language. After the Revolutionary War, he declined multiple invitations to visit France. He would have been welcomed in Paris as a hero, but he would also have required a translator, and he was embarrassed by that possibility. When Washington married the widow Martha Custis, he became the guardian of her son Jack and her daughter Patsy. He worked hard to give them the education he had not received. He hired expensive tutors when they were young. Later, he looked for someone who could supervise Jack's preparation for college, eventually sending him to study with the Reverend Jonathan Boucher. The Reverend was not impressed. He complained to Washington that while Jack was clearly a charming child, he appeared to have no academic ability of any kind. Washington defended his stepson, but he had to admit that Jack's interests and accomplishments tended to involve just three things: guns, horses, and dogs. When Boucher said that Jack was charming, he didn't really mean it as a compliment. The Reverend School moved from Alexandria, Virginia, to Annapolis, Maryland. And shortly after the move, Boucher wrote to Washington and said, "I think this move may have been a mistake. The town of Annapolis is filled with vagrants, dandies, drunkards, gamblers, ne'er-do-wells of every description, and your son has befriended all of them." At about this time, Jack wrote a letter to George Washington in which he apologized for his grades. And he also apologized for recent letters to his mother that had contained far too many grammatical errors and spelling mistakes. He thanked George Washington for reminding him of those mistakes. He promised to do better in the future, to study harder, to make his parents proud. It was a pitch-perfect letter of apology, until it ended. At the very end of the letter, he said, "I do hope you and Mama will visit me here in Annapolis because I want to show you my favorite place in the city." It was the racetrack. Jack had made the classic mistake: too much information. When it came time to choose a college for Jack to attend, Washington exchanged multiple letters with Boucher. He began by suggesting the College of New Jersey, a school we now know as Princeton. But Boucher said there was going to be a problem. Princeton had standards. The president of the College of New Jersey was actually familiar with Jack's case and pointed out to Boucher that the lad had learned no Greek. He was clearly not prepared for Princeton. Boucher then suggested William and Mary. Apparently, in the late 18th century, William and Mary was a safety school if you couldn't get into Princeton, as of course it still is. Things change slowly in higher education. Imagine how much slower they change in Virginia. This time it was Washington who said no. William and Mary would not do. Washington had been a member of the colonial legislature, a frequent visitor to the Capitol, and he said that the teachers at William and Mary gave insufficient attention to the moral development of their students. Besides, there were too many taverns in Williamsburg. What about the College of Philadelphia was the next suggestion, a school founded in part by Benjamin Franklin. Boucher said no, it would never do. They had a flexible curriculum, and a motivated student who took some initiative could easily earn an excellent education at such a place. But we're talking about Jack. Boucher proposed King's College. At King's, the school we now know as Columbia, they followed the Oxford method and gave each student individual attention. So King's College it was. George Washington, who was more than a little bit busy at this time in his life, those letters went back and forth in the early 1770s, nevertheless decided to ride on horseback with Jack all the way from Mount Vernon to New York City. He didn't trust his stepson on his own, particularly in the colony of Maryland, where Jack had a girlfriend. Besides, Washington wanted to have some private conversations with the teachers at King's College. He hoped to explain the challenges they would face if their course of study had no connection to guns, horses, or dogs. It would be unfair to call George Washington a helicopter parent, the helicopter and the airport having not yet been invented. But he was a horseback parent, and he rode in circles around every aspect of Jack's education, to no avail. King's College did not work out. There was never a major academic crisis, but as Boucher had written to Washington, you do know that your son does not much care for books. Patsy, Martha's daughter, suffered from poor health throughout her life, died of a seizure when she was 17. That may have made Martha anxious to have her only remaining child closer to home. Jack left King's College before completing a single year. He married the girl in Maryland who was wealthier than he was, and together they began to live lavishly with the land and money they inherited. Washington was not happy about the end of his education or about the lavish living, but the two reconciled. Jack became an officer in the Revolutionary War and died at Yorktown. George Washington's greatest military victory occurred at the same time as his and Martha's grief. In order to help Jack's widow, George and Martha adopted her two youngest children and raised them. Washington was once again in charge of education. He was older now, wiser, and now the most famous person in America. But Washington basically repeated all the same mistakes he had made with Jack. There was some progress. Jack dropped out of one college, his son dropped out of two. A scholar who studied Washington's efforts to secure a good education for his children called it his longest losing battle. The battle was lost, but Washington never surrendered. He was always, throughout his life, optimistic and enthusiastic about education. He took an avid interest in family members, friends, and neighbors, who were heading off to college. He sent them money. Sending money is always a good idea. And he wrote letters of encouragement. Washington gave the following advice to one college-bound relative. You are now extending into that stage of life when good or bad habits are formed, when the mind will be turned to things useful and praiseworthy, or to dissipation and vice. Needless to say, the father of our country was not in favor of dissipation and vice. That other phrase, things useful and praiseworthy, is one I've always liked and often used. It's an apt description of the curriculum that many of you will be introduced to for the first time tomorrow morning. Here at Washington and Lee, we offer instruction in both the useful and the praiseworthy. The useful courses include those that expose you to languages, literatures, cultures, and histories of different civilizations. Classes in mathematics and social science that hone skills in quantitative analysis. Laboratories that give firsthand experience in empirical observation. Studios where you create art. And seminars, lots of seminars, that involve intensive conversation, critical thinking, and careful writing. Everywhere you look in our catalog, there are useful courses. But you will also study, here at Washington and Lee, things praiseworthy. Things like truth, beauty, virtue, justice. Fundamental questions about the existence of God, the nature of the universe, the foundations of social cooperation, and the essence of the human condition. These are concepts and questions that have long been part of liberal education, and their utility is often challenged. Wrongly. In fact, the useful and the praiseworthy are deeply intertwined. You develop useful skills when you study praiseworthy topics, and the praiseworthy topics themselves are extremely useful, particularly when they help us live lives rich in meaning, ethical integrity, and intellectual freedom. George Washington actually knew that. The idea he had about higher education was not all that far removed from some of the basic things we do today here at Washington and Lee. And he was deadly serious when he told young people they should take advantage of their college years and turn their minds to the useful and praiseworthy. But Washington wanted young Americans to go to college for another reason. Education wasn't just about personal enrichment. For him, it was also part of a solution to a serious political problem. During his presidency, George Washington urged the Congress on multiple occasions to appropriate money for two institutions of higher learning, a military academy and a national university. The academy, which became West Point, was eventually funded during Jefferson's administration. The national university was never built. But why did Washington want one? Why did he consider it one of his highest priorities? Why was he deeply disappointed that the Congress could never find money for it? Our first president worried about the future of the republic he had helped to create. In his farewell address, he warned about the dangers of partisanship and sectionalism. He feared that we would become so divided and so rancorous toward each other that we would destroy our own liberties and create the opportunity for foreign enemies to take advantage of our internal division. This would occur because it's natural to love your locality more than your nation, and because unscrupulous leaders would inflame regional jealousy and partisan difference. Here's how Washington described the danger. The divisions within the United States will become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. And don't think the competition between two political parties will protect us. Again, Washington's words. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, is itself a frightful despotism. and it leads to something worse. The disorders and miseries which result from partisanship gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of a single individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. A grim prediction. Now, you may have noticed that we've drifted a bit from our original topic. I started out talking about Washington's foibles as a father of a college-bound student, and we have somehow ended up with a nation descending into despotism. The despotism is not Jack's fault, but we haven't actually gone that far afield. Education is the link. Washington was convinced that our nation needed mechanisms, as many as we could find, to overcome or reduce our sectional differences, our local loyalties, and our penchant for partisanship. One way to do that was to bring talented students from different parts of the country, with different backgrounds, different opinions, to a common location where they would share enriching experience. A place like this one, a school like ours. Washington understood that young people form friendships faster and in a more lasting fashion than do people who are older. And he wanted to harness the positive power of youthful association. When young people get to know each other, it can reduce the suspicions they have about those who suffer from the grave misfortune of having grown up in the North, or the South, or Texas. George Washington was an advocate of diversity in college admissions. He wanted a national university so that future leaders from all parts of the country could meet in their formative years and break down the misconceptions and misunderstandings that they would naturally acquire from their family, their hometown, their church, or political party. He was no Pollyanna, he had no utopian expectation, but he sincerely believed that college could make a positive difference. Talented young people earning an excellent education, side by side, in a diverse community, could push back against the dangers of sectionalism and partisanship. Now, I think we all understand that George Washington's lessons about education have their limitations. He lived in a time and a world far removed from our own. He never challenged the assumption of his day that higher education was for men and not for women. He owned enslaved people who were rarely taught to read and write. He fully participated in the horrors of slavery and was a leader of the generation that pronounced the principle of God-given equality before writing a constitution with more than a few concessions to slaveholding states. Washington never publicly condemned the institution of slavery, but in his last will and testament, he freed the slaves that he owned. He was the only slave-owning signer of the Constitution to take that step. For the newly emancipated who were older, he made provision for their care late in life. For the young, he set aside funds to pay for basic education and apprenticeship in a trade. Elsewhere in his will, Washington repeated the details of the generous gift he made to Liberty Hall Academy, the name this institution had before it became Washington College and then Washington and Lee University. He gave money to an orphanage in Alexandria so that they could build a school. And he created an endowment to be used at a later date to support the national university he championed throughout his presidency. As we begin this academic year, revisiting George Washington's thoughts about education is, I hope, worthwhile. It's certainly humbling to a politics professor to note that the most important person in the creation of this nation was self-taught and never needed to learn anything from people like me. In many ways, Washington's university was the French and Indian War. The war challenged him, In it, he made serious mistakes, mistakes from which he learned lessons, lessons that helped him later in life accomplish remarkable things. But that was a practical education, and not the one he wanted for himself or for the children in his care. When you earn the kind of education that George Washington and Jack missed out on, you will encounter things useful and praiseworthy, and you will, I am sure, follow Washington's sound advice and resist the temptations of dissipation and vice, temptations that could arise at any time, perhaps later this evening. I trust this year at Washington and Lee will be successful for you, but I hope it will also be helpful to our nation. Among you are some of the future leaders George Washington wanted to bring to a national university. You'll become a better leader and a better person if we all embrace diversity and create an educational community where study and friendship push back against the powerful things that divide us, against provincialism, against prejudice, against partisanship. In Washington's honor, in his name, let's make that our common task in the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Strong, for that fine and especially appropriate address. I think you can all agree with me that we were very lucky to have Bob Strong at Washington and Lee, and I was very lucky to get to teach with him a couple of years ago. May I ask everyone to stand for the Washington and Lee hymn, please?
But when
Thank you again, University Singers. Please remain standing. I want to close by reiterating what I said at the outset. We're here to do important work, which we can only do together. We're privileged to serve a noble mission to which each of us makes distinctive contributions. This can sometimes get forgotten in the bustle of our daily routines, but I want to join Professor Strong in urging you to remember that what we do here matters, and doing it well should bring you a deep and deserved sense of satisfaction. I'd like to thank the class of 1942, whose generous gift supports this convocation each year. I'd like to thank facilities and public safety for their extra efforts on this occasion, and I would like to thank dining services for the meal that awaits us on Cannon Green. With that, and in my formal capacity as the president of Washington and Lee, I officially open the 2019-2020 academic year. May it be a good one for all of you. We are adjourned. Thank you.